Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, nature is angry, and we fool ourselves if we think we can fool nature, because nature always strikes back, and around the world, nature is striking back with fury.
The situation in Australia, already in a state of emergency, is getting more dire tonight.
A remarkable and alarming scene playing out in Venice.
In recent months, climate emergencies have been declared.
Frustration is also boiling hot over a government seen as unambitious on global warming.
Look around. Seas are rising and oceans are acidifying. Glaciers are melting and corals are bleaching. Droughts are spreading and wildfires are burning. Deserts are expanding and access to water is dwindling. Heat waves are scorching and natural disasters are multiplying. Storms everywhere are more intense, more frequent, more deadly. I've seen it with my own eyes, from Dominica to the Sahel to the South Pacific. Our warming Earth is issuing a chilling cry. Stop. If we don't urgently change our ways of life, we jeopardize life itself.
Since I was a child, I know that this was a problem that was going to affect me in the future. And as a child of the first world country, you live quite well. You have money, you have family, fortunately. But I know that there was a danger, even though I was just 8 years old, I know that there was a danger coming, which was the climate emergency.
As we're growing up, we've had to think about a lot more hard things. There are a lot of people already now, like even myself at 16, thinking about whether or not it's even ethical to have children at this time.
Did you have to worry of these things when you were my age? All this is happening before our eyes, and yet we act as if we have all the time we want and all the solutions.
How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
Return now in your imagination to England as it was 200 years ago.
The mainstream story of progress divides history into a big before and after, and it considers like a big break from the past happening in the last 300 years with the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, and the growth of production and consumption, the cornucopia of new goods, of consumer goods, new technologies.
This amazing change began in England of the late 17th century. England with her ships, coal, timber, iron, money, and laborers. The first sign of the revolution in industry appeared in improvements in metals, steam engines, and textile machines. The rapid industrial development called for more transportation and more ships to bring in raw materials and carry back finished products. Thus, in a short time, England became the leading industrial nation of the world.
There are these big narratives which many politicians thrive on, and Those are the big narratives which say that what's important in this world is that we all have a high level of consumerist lifestyle and that everybody deserves that. So we need to have a world that everybody can have a car, have a fridge, whatever narrative you want to have.
We must embark on a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas.
They're the narratives which are easy to hear for people. The more difficult narratives are what happens when you do pursue that kind of life, because you're actually doing it at the expense of the environment, at the expense of non-human beings, and also at the expense of care.
The way it works is you get to a place, you use all the resources you have in that place, you exploit the labor, the land, nature, care, all in the area, and you use it to make a profit.
Growth from its beginnings was premised and based on the colonization of non-white, non-European territories. So if we start with cotton, we see that production of cotton in England wouldn't be possible there were technological breakthroughs, but it wouldn't be possible without slave labor in the US, in the plantations.
The enormous amount of hand labor required to grow and pick the cotton was supplied by great numbers of slaves. This, then, was the economic background of the plantation. Cheap slave labor producing one main crop on vast tracts of land.
And it wouldn't be possible without destroying the subsistence and the low-scale production in India to create new markets where the English would export their extra cotton. So in one sense, growth from the beginning rests on colonization, both for extracting resources, labor and resources, and also for expanding its market.
And when that enters in crisis, when the soil gets exhausted, when workers revolt because they want a higher pay, then you move somewhere else. Capital moves somewhere else, and this is how it works. It works through crisis and moving somewhere else. The problem we see now is that capital doesn't know where to go anymore because it's expanded in so many places. It's still expanding in Africa, especially now in some places in Asia, but it's finding it increasingly difficult to get this return, to get this profit. That's why they also invented all these financial products, all these deliverables, hedge funds, bonds. All this is a way to increase this profit in this alternative economy, which actually, because it's so volatile and it actually depends on the real economy that we live in, that when these calculations don't work well, then we are the ones that pay for these mistakes, no?
And this is the sort of embodiment, really, of a set of values that came from colonialism, genocide, slavery, extraction, and it's just manifested in this system. This system is the best articulation of the old values that were exported from Western Europe to the rest of the world.
It is all the same. They come for the resources. We must protect the resources. Nothing has changed in 500 years. It is the reason why we live. After so many years of cultural genocide, we must stand for that.
They are fighting every day, and their relatives are being assassinated. They are being killed for just protecting their lands or their way of living, their way of sustaining their lives.
What kind of progress is it to produce a world which is on the edge of destroying itself, where people are increasingly radically insecure about their futures? What kind of progress is it that brings about the sixth mass extinction, so that we're exterminating approximately one species every 15 minutes?
There were other ways in which we could have conceptualized progress, even within the dominant progress framework, but also we can also question this framework and can question what progress means.
If we look at the history of international environmental policy, since the 70s, there was a debate that was triggered by the Limits to Growth report.
The program was originally devised by a scientist working from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Jay Forrester. It was developed under the auspices of the Club of Rome by an MIT research team to present a complex model of the world and what we humans are doing to it.
The most important lesson is that we're near the end of our development of society, which has been going on for about 2,000 years. That we've reached levels of prosperity which carry the seeds of disruption and necessitate a complete relook at the whole world's social, political and other situations.
So the debate at the time was really radical, even at the mainstream level. And for instance, there was a questioning of the pathways of production and consumption in wealthy countries. It was very clear that the focus should be the wealthy countries, that we should produce and consume less, and that states needed to take action.
What is being suggested is that the only way to ensure the future for our grandchildren is to stop getting richer. Only then will there be the resources and the unpolluted world that they will need to survive.
The classic assumption that economic growth was what society had to do is being proven wrong. It is obvious that our instabilities are caused by this endless attempt to increase output, call it just output. Now our attempts have got to be directed to looking after people who haven't got anything and to reorganizing our own society.
So the mainstream really got afraid of this, and the proposal for sustainable development in the 80s is the reaction to that. From the mainstream they were wondering, how do we water down that radical critique that is coming from the environmentalists to the mainstream growth and development model.
20 years ago, some spoke of the limits to growth. And today we realize that growth is the engine of change and the friend of the environment.
So suddenly, the response to the environmental crisis, if in the 70s it was very clear that it should be produced and consumed less in rich countries, in the 80s it becomes, oh no, in poor countries they have to consume more because you need to be rich in order to be green.
Energy. Sometimes I think I'm running out of energy. Seems like we use an awful lot for heating.
When we discuss about climate change, we are basically discussing about energy.
Then one day, men discovered that coal would do it better. Minus dark, and it looked like it might just last forever.
Energy is central for climate change because carbon emissions depend on fossil fuels. And there is a very strong relationship, and it's a very complex one, between energy and economic growth. So, of course, the impressive economic growth that we have experienced since the Industrial Revolution in industrialized countries was thanks to the fact that we had fossil fuels available, which was basically photosynthesis for millions of years bottled, concentrated into certain reserves of coal, gas, and oil. So now in 100 years, we are like burning, like in a party, the wine that we had been, or nature had been producing during millions of years.
So the concept of green growth has been kicking around for a long time. The idea that we can continue growing the economy while at the same time reducing our impact on the ecology.
We can carry on growing, we can carry on consuming, we can carry on using energy, we just need to do it better.
The idea that you can have green growth, but you can decouple that from the consumption of energy and therefore from CO2 emission is very problematic. First, because when you plot on a graph GDP, economic growth, and carbon emission, the two curves goes like this. So there is a very strong, we would say, positive correlation in statistical terms. And the more you burn fossil fuels, the more the economy grows, and the more you grow, the more energy you need. No?
The idea is that we can carry on growing, we can carry on growing the economy, but we can detach that from our energy and consumption. So the idea is we can carry on, but we consume less. And how we do that? We do that by what I was saying, by recycling and reusing more and doing it better. The problem with that is that it hasn't happened.
One argument that is made is that you can burn fossil fuels more efficiently, so you can do more with less energy. This is partially true, and it is true in relative terms. It means that, of course, for a unit of GDP, gross domestic product, we are using less energy now than we used to do 50 years ago. It's obvious.
The problem with that is that it's been proved over the years that we use this energy that we save, or the money that we save, and we actually invest it in more consumption. For example, we have the light bulbs. We invented these more efficient light bulbs, the LEDs now, and we think that's great, we're gonna consume a lot less energy with them. But what happens? That because they consume less energy, people leave them on all night. So at the end, you consume a lot more energy. The same with TV screens. They're a lot more efficient now, but then we produce bigger TV screens. And the same with everything that we improve in efficiency.
So, first argument that efficiency can be improved is problematic because we don't see any absolute effects that we are reducing the consumption of fossil fuels. The other argument is that we can have renewable energy substituting fossil fuels.
But the trick is simply that is the time frame we have remaining to do this in. Because we have to work with the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees as per the Paris Agreement, which is an extremely small and shrinking budget. And so the question is, can we manage to reduce our emissions to zero without blowing the carbon budget for 1.5 or 2 degrees, while at the same time growing the economy? Now, the tricky bit about this is that as we grow the economy, it requires more energy, right? So effectively, the energy system that we have to transition over to renewables grows at the same time that we're trying to make that transition.
What we see right now empirically in the last decades is that the renewable energies, the energy that is generated is just adding up to the fossil fuels that is consumed. So there is no sign for the moment that the energy that is produced with renewable energies is actually substituting fossil fuels.
The point is clear, and that is that, if we continue growing the energy system while shifting over to renewables, not only does that make the task of making the transition much more difficult, but also is going to involve an ever-increasing amount of materials that will have to be extracted in order to produce these solar panels and wind turbines.
Thinking that we can transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy without reducing the energy demand, I think right now is really a fallacy. It's like dreamland, is something that cannot be done.
So if we want to avoid climate catastrophe, the IPCC scientists realized that we needed to absolutely lower our energy and material consumption. But that was very risky. That was a proposal that politicians, that lobbyists, that companies weren't going to accept. So they needed to come up with other solutions.
And the one that they rely primarily on is one called BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage.
And BECCS, basically, it's quite amazing. BECCS will imply big plantations of trees, who knows where, obviously not here in the global north, plantations of trees, then you cut those trees, you turn them into little pieces, you transport them.
Burn it for energy in power stations, capture the CO2 that gets emitted from those power stations, solidify it and store it deep under the ground. And in doing so, we basically have an energy system that not only does not emit CO2, but actually pulls CO2 out of the air because the biofuels draw CO2 down as they grow.
The thing is, anyway, this hasn't been tested. The technology hasn't been tested. We don't know even if it's going to work.
And yet, it was such an alluring idea to policymakers that they began including it in all of these IPCC models. It was the only way they could find to reconcile the steep downward emissions trajectories that we need with a continuation of economic growth as we know it, right? So it became kind of the savior technology for the possibility of green growth.
To limit warming to 1.5 degrees C, we would need to start taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere during the 21st century. The methods for doing this include planting trees, bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage, changed land management, as well as some novel approaches that are very early stages of development. However, carbon dioxide removal on a large scale could have implications for food security, for ecosystems, and for biodiversity.
There's a whole range of issues there. Clearly, in the IPCC forecasts or predictions or prognoses, whatever they call them, for the 1.5 degree report, there's a lot of BECCS, lots of bioenergy and carbon sequestration in those scenarios, and they don't play out unless you got that. There's huge uncertainties about whether that is A, feasible, and B, desirable for a number of other reasons.
Policymakers should not assume that they can relax and wait for some mythical technology that's going to suck carbon dioxide out of the air to be technologically feasible and affordable. That may never happen.
It's an incredible gamble, because if we rely on that hope, and if it doesn't materialize, then we're locked into a high temperature pathway from which we cannot escape.
This is the time to wake up. This is the moment in history we need to be wide awake. And yet, wherever I go, I seem to be surrounded by fairy tales. Business leaders, elected officials, all across the political spectrum, spending their time making up and telling bedtime stories.
When I discovered degrowth, I think that I kind of thought that it was the future, and it was the most important thing we could do right now, because many people, politicians talking about alternatives to the system that we have now, to the ways of production, the ways of consumption, the ways of moving through places, but nobody is talking about reducing.
We have CO2 emissions rising, we need to cut them. The solutions that are proposed, the technical solutions, are not enough. Therefore, we need to come up with ways to reduce in energy and consumption, and this connects directly with degrowth ideas.
Degrowth is the hypothesis that we can live well, in common, in solidarity, in conviviality, and we don't need so many materials and energy. In other ways, degrowth is two things. On one end, it is a critique of the hegemony of growth, of the idea that our society are centered around growth and we need growth to survive. But it's also a proposal for something different. And this would be, in wealthy industrialized countries, we would need to reduce production and consumption. This would need to be democratically decided. And we would not do this for the sake of doing it, for the sake of reduction or anything. We would do this keeping in mind that the horizon, the objectives, are well-being, ecological sustainability, and social equity.
And so the whole field of degrowth scholarship is organized around thinking about what that looks like. And at this point, there's robust proposals for what a degrowth economy could look like. That in fact, that we argue could deliver even higher levels of human well-being than people presently enjoy. In terms of what really matters, to people, in terms of healthcare and education and, time with their families and relationships and leisure and so on.
Overall, consumer spending grew at a pace of 2.9% last quarter, the best showing since 2007. But with 70% of all economic activity dependent on the consumer, the holiday shopping season is seen as key for growth in the months ahead.
I just bought the things I wanted, I just consumed what I wanted, but I never thought if I was happy living like this.
If you buy something in the shop, it's calculated, buying something in the shop, it gives you 15 minutes happiness. 15 minutes. And at the end, what gives you happiness is not those, buying things.
We have
high level of income, we have another car, we have a third house, we have a kind of better yacht, we have a kind of, and most importantly, income increase, we have a kind of higher profile job, and within a couple of months we get used to that. So our initial increase in happiness is actually lost and drops back to normal. So one of the reasons is that we adapt to all the material improvements in our lives. But the other reason is that what matters for our well-being is not so much the absolute level of income that we gain, but the relative level of income that we get, in the sense of how much we have in comparisons with the others. We need to kind of constantly then go into the rat race of earning for more so that we can temporarily get another increase in happiness and then have to earn for more and have to run for more so that we can constantly get this kind of temporary increase in happiness. So what happens is that our materialistic achievements don't really contribute to our well-being. Well, this does not mean that income and material standards and material needs are not important for happiness. Of course, they're key for happiness. This is why actually entering in employment is extremely important for happiness. This means actually that once we cover our basic needs, once we reach a certain level of threshold level of income, all type of income increases afterwards just don't contribute to our satisfaction of life unless we are above everyone else. But only few of us could be above everyone else, and only for a temporary amount of time.
Ultimately, if you ask people, maybe you could say at the end of their life or in moments of reflection, what is important to you? They're not going to say, oh, I have 5 cars and 20 houses. It's, I have the love of my children or the love of my nearest or my dog or whatever. So those things are very important to us. We're not valuing them in this profoundly deep way that I think we should be.
I guess there's a few core policies that would have to be at the heart of any degrowth agenda. And I think the very first and most obvious one is to shift away from GDP as a measure of economic progress. It was never intended to be a measure of progress. It's relatively new in its use as a measure of progress, and it's fundamentally destructive because it basically allows us to count significantly bad things as good things.
We have to change how we produce and circulate money. One important intervention would be to control the lending of money from banks. The way money is created right now, it is created as loans and debt. And there are interesting proposals under the banner of positive money or about public money by Mary Mellor on how the state can take control of the supply of money directed in socially and environmentally useful projects and not introduce money into society as debt, which then creates an imperative of growth in order to repay this debt.
Money, especially US-based fiat currency, is the only thing that grows in perpetuity. It makes no sense for that to be the case, because then your requirement, if you have a debt-based growth economy, is for your growth rate to exceed your interest rate in order for that money to be valuable, in order for that debt to be paid back. And then you're in this perpetual cycle we're in. 3% growth a year, as we're told is the requirement, means doubling of the global economy every 20 years.
Come on, you ain't out, sell 900. Anyone do that? I want to sell 600. 250 for sale.
So normally when we have a kind of contraction scenario, then unemployment rises, and this is a social catastrophe for people. And so the easiest way to solve that problem is by shifting to a shorter working week, by shortening the working week. And that way you're able to make sure that the necessary labor in the economy is shared equally, so that everybody is shared more equally, at least, so that everybody has access to a job, which is the main conduit for livelihood through wages, right? So as you shorten the working week, make sure everybody has access to meaningful employment, then at the same time you'd have to increase hourly wages to make sure that people at the same time as working less can still acquire the money they need to live good lives.
We might even consider then a sort of basic income or household income to support everyone to have enough time and resources available to take care of themselves and and their dependence without having to depend on the vagaries of the market.
Could you imagine 7 or 8 billion human beings freed from the toil of work and having the resources to do what they actually want to do? We would have new media companies, we'd have a revolution in regenerative agriculture, we would have all sorts of solutions, alternatives to the capitalist extractive way of living.
And then another one I really like about degrowth is limiting publicity, limiting and actually regulating all the obsolescence, program obsolescence of products. This is something it wouldn't be that difficult to do.
You could do that simply by having mandatory long-term lifespans for products with extended warranties, a kind of right to repair, so that instead of having to buy new products, you can get them easily repaired. It's quite feasible to have washing machines and refrigerators that last not 5 or 10 years, but 20 or 30 years. And to have iPhones that are modular and repairable so that the same body lasts for 20 or 30 years and can be updated regularly without any additional material purchase.
The poor of the world look to economic growth for a way out of their poverty and their starvation.
And for us, in the West, it gives us the increasing standard of living we've grown to expect.
The crucial thing here is to recognize that there's a distinction between rich countries and poor nations and poor countries when it comes to the question of degrowth. So most advocates of degrowth don't call for degrowth in the global south or in poorer nations, recognizing that in some nations, an increase in aggregate GDP even might be necessary in order to generate the resources required for investing in healthcare and education and so on. That's disputable by some people, but what we do know for sure is that degrowth has to happen in rich nations, where extremely high levels of aggregate GDP and excess consumption are the primary drivers of ecological breakdown around the world.
So degrowth implies acknowledgement and repayment of the ecological debt. Recognizing that ecological debt would imply huge redistribution of resources from the north to the south.
And by doing so, by shifting income from the richest to the poor and to ordinary people, then we're able to ensure that without any additional aggregate growth, we can improve people's lives and meet people's existing needs. Okay? So we already know, for example, that globally we can eradicate poverty at a high poverty line of, say, $7 or $8 per day, of ensuring that everybody has access to healthcare and education and good nutrition and shelter and so on, simply by shifting an extremely small fraction of global income from the richest. It's about 7% of the income of the top 10%. Of the richest 10% would be needed to end global poverty in a single stroke forever, right? This kind of redistribution approach is quite different from the dominant existing development approach, which is grow the world economy and hope that some trickles down to the poor, which of course is an ecologically insane approach to ending human misery. The mantra of degrowth is that equality can be an antidote to the growth imperative. If our goal is to achieve certain social objectives of human well-being, we can do that right now without any growth at all.
So degrowth brings us to the basics, but at the same time having a very emancipatory way of seeing the world, because it also talks about social issues. It also talks about care, taking care of the land, of the earth, taking care of the people that surround you. So it's like going to the basics so as to stop and say, let's rethink the way in which humanity is progressing, if we are progressing.
The biggest challenge is that the way our institutional systems are structured right now, a lot of power rests with people who have money, And the people who have money have a whole lives structured around the fact that they do have money, and their culture and their own sense of self-appreciation or self-valorization is linked around the fact that they have money and power.
I'm not going to lose that wealth. I'm not going to lose it on dreams, on windmills, which frankly aren't working too well.
Obviously, the one at the top now don't want that change, because this will require some of them to lower the status, this power status. And this is going to be difficult.
We need to act now. It's not too late to act, but really we need to get moving.
11,000 scientists from 153 countries are bolstering that claim.
Governments of the world will also need to shift economic goals away from GDP growth to contain the massive consumption our modern lifestyle embraces.
We need to give up, but do we need to give up
on
economic growth? Is that what's needed in order to achieve what you say is absolutely vital?
My own view is that it is, but all these questions would be put to the Citizens' Assembly. That's the beauty of our proposal, right? All we're saying is, look, here's where we've got to get to. You cannot negotiate with the atmosphere. Let's have a Citizens' Assembly, let's have the people to decide how we do it.
Giving up on growth?
Green growth is what we want. We want to do it just like Jess's car manufacturers looking at ways of bringing electric vehicles.
But it might be too late.
I'm not sure that they are really aware of the climate crisis, and I think that they are not aware of the solutions that we need, because if you are realistic, or if you listen to science says that the technological solution is not possible in the actual system. So why do they insist that much in this solution if it's not possible?
A crucial part of what's happening right now is that the youth are rising up. It's terrible that it has to be this way. It's terrible that our children feel the need to go out of school and miss some of their learning to try to stand up to say, look, we want a future, save our world. It's terrible that our children are reduced in this way to begging for our lives, but that's where we are.
One of the biggest things that anybody can learn from this youth climate movement right now, being built on in the work of Indigenous Black and Brown communities, is the fact that it is an issue of priorities, the climate crisis. Because when we want to talk about economic growth over people having clean water and the right to a livable future and planet, that is a sign that something is wrong.
Have this media apparatus and sort of the filter bubbles of the internet and all the algorithms of social media, etc., that make us feel like these are disparate uprisings that are based on individuals who wanted to stand up for their local community. And of course, it's much bigger than that. What's happening with Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for the Future and Occupy and the African Awakenings and the Zapatista movement and Rojava and Kurdistan is these are the white blood cells of humanity responding to an immune system crisis. And they're all connected by the same desires for a post-capitalist world, a post-patriarchal world, a post-colonialist world. And yet we're told that these are separate one-off initiatives.
It's a process. Walk your talk. If you want to change systems, you have to start by changing self.
Yeah, any change will involve both cultural change and political change. So you cannot have one without having the other. So you cannot have different politics without having people who are willing to support this politics and struggle for this politics to come true, and also willing to accept the changes that this politics bring.
The central issue is that it's a different value than growth, and that actually if you thought about care as a value, as something that you actually could understand as why you're involved or engaged or relating to others, then that would really shift our understanding of how economies operate.
Because capitalism has been exploiting nature, and it has been exploiting women as much as it has been exploiting workers. So we need to realize this, and we need to put this priority at the center of the picture, which is gender equality and which is climate justice.
It's a mindset switch that we all have to make if we want to be able to create actual change. Because we can talk about lowering carbon emissions all we want, But if we're not prioritizing people, if we're not prioritizing their problems and their lifestyles, we're not creating sustainable solutions.
The Prime Minister of Iceland, Katrin Jakobsdottir, has teamed up with Scotland's Nicola Sturgeon and New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern to promote what they've dubbed the well-being agenda. It's meant to put social measurements like health and happiness ahead of traditional GDP figures.
We're fundamentally changing the way that we do policy making to make sure that we deliver on well-being, not just economic success.
We tend to think about growth in its natural surroundings as something very positive. But we need to think about how is it achieved and what does it cost.
It is more important than ever that we ask and find the answers to those questions and promote a vision of society that has well-being, not just wealth, at its very heart.
I can see change. When it's no longer native and non-native, it's no longer the colonizer and the one to colonize. It's no longer the Christian and the anti-Christian. It is no longer the Muslim and the anti-Muslim. It is just people. And so I can start to see a vision of system change. Each in their own way, in their own culture, in their own sovereignty, without interfering in anybody else's, but being able to work together.
We are fighting the same fight, no matter if you are at school striking for the climate, if you are protecting a forest from being cut down, or if you're protesting a pipeline. It is the same fight across the world. We are at a point in time where we are questioning the very things that have built up our daily lives. What are the things right now that are causing this crisis?
Like we are fighting here against climate change or against the inaction, but we are seeing like the last part of the problem, which is the global warming, like the catastrophes that it is creating, but they are seeing the cause, which is extractivism, exploitation of nature, capitalism.
There is no sustainable solution if we do not criticize capitalism. Really, the exploitation and the greed that comes along with capitalism is what we need to tackle. And it's a personal decision to look that in the eye. When we are talking about what matters to us, it shouldn't be a question. The answer should always be my children, the environment around me, and the future. And capitalism doesn't save room for any of that. It only saves room for economic growth. It does make sense.
Suits are moving in just to get that dollar. Treat is being broken, no respect or honor. Listen close, my friend, this is happening.
What is a sustainable world that you would like to live in?
If you are around, stand up like a mountain.
That would satisfy your deepest dreams.
Rise up from the earth, one love, one message. I know that we are strong in spirit, and if you are the righteous, hear it. If you are around, stand up like a mountain. Burn the sage and cedar. Spirit is the leader. Warrior, warrior, the clouds are getting heavy. Thunder beings are ready. Yeah. Warrior, warrior, where the oil spills, we cannot drink the water. 7 generations are the sons and daughters. Yeah.